When you were mentioning spending a week with Girls Gone Wild, and one of the things that the young women would do for this was to make out with each other.
Uh-huh.
Is part of this kind of raunch culture doing lesbian kind of things, not because you're a lesbian, but because it's cool or because it's a turn-on for men?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, these high school kids in Oakland, California were telling me how that, at the school dances, they're always sort of making out with each other and giving the guys lap dances. I mean, if I try to imagine that happening at my high school dance, it's like we were so much more hung up in some ways. Although, I mean, I don't think that what's happening, back to this idea of this isn't free love, I don't think what's happening is that these kids are just sort of like wildly sensuous and, completely, just letting their passion sort of set free. Again, I think it's more about performance. And when I interviewed these kids, I mean, they weren't using the lexicon of sort of smoldering pleasure. They were talking about shows. They were talking about, well, I've seen this, on so-and-so's MySpace page, or I've seen this on MTV. I mean, this is what you're supposed to do. And yeah, I absolutely think that the business of girls making out, I mean, it's like a porn tableau. But I mean, all these kids, of course, will be really fast to tell you, well, I'm not bisexual or anything like that. I mean, there's still, I don't think it means that they're just completely comfortable with that idea.
So why did they tell you they do it?
They want to fit in. And I mean, they think about Paris Hilton. I mean, here's this young woman who was sort of just another bold-faced name until this amateur sex tape came out, which is what rocketed her into, mega stardom. I mean, it's such a contrast when you think about how recently it was that the revelation that a woman had appeared in any kind of pornography would have ruined her career. I mean, you think about Vanessa Williams having her crown taken away once they found out these pictures of her kissing another woman. And she was able to make this comeback as a singer, but then porn was something you had to make a comeback from. Now, porn is itself the thing that makes you famous.
So what was your understanding of feminism when you were coming of age? And I should mention here that, you, as you described in your book, your mother is a shiatsu masseuse who attended weekly women's consciousness-raising groups for 24 years and didn't own any makeup. And your father has been a consultant to Planned Parenthood, the National Abortion Rights
Action League.
Action League, yes, and now. So, so what kind of understanding of feminism were you brought up with, and what did it mean to you?
I was very impassioned about it. I mean, I remember being, in like 6th grade or something, and sort of standing on my soapbox and giving spiels about this stuff. I mean, I always felt very strongly about it, and I always felt irked by the way I experienced this pressure for girls to be quieter and to sort of, take up less space than boys. I mean, as a child, that, as a very verbal, loud child, I always thought that was an outrageous thing, that boys were sort of encouraged to talk a lot and that people were always telling me to be quiet. So, I mean, I was always very self-righteous about it, I think. And I mean, I think to both my parents' credit, particularly to my dad's credit, I think I had the good fortune of having a father who really always pressured me to be funny and pressured me to be smart and didn't ever talk about the way I looked one way or the other. And I think that's a great thing. I think that's a great gift for a dad to give his daughter.
Now, one thing you write in your book is that raunch culture feels the most alien to aging hippies like my parents, but it's actually also a repercussion of the forces they set in motion. In what way do you see raunch culture as being a repercussion of 60s hippie culture or 60s feminist culture?
Well, I mean, I think on the most simplistic level, if you sort of reduce, the sexual liberation movement and the women's liberation movement to their most commercial sort of base level, you can see traces of that in raunch culture. I mean, it's a perversion of what those movements were supposed to stand for, but you can sort of see where they have some history in that. But I think in a more direct way, what you see young women doing is nobody wants to turn into their mother, right? So there's this generational rebellion where these young women, whether their mothers were radical feminists or evangelical Christians, either way, they know that on some level, they know that by flashing their breasts for Girls Gone Wild, they're infuriating their moms and defining themselves in a very different way.
I'm going to quote you again. You write, you write, many of the conflicts between the women's liberation movement and the sexual revolution, and many of the conflicts within the women's liberation movement, remain unresolved. What we are seeing today is the residue of that confusion. Would you elaborate on that?
Yes, of course. What most members of the women's liberation movement have said to me, is that they consider the last gasp of radical feminism to have been the so-called porn wars in the 80s, which of course posited so-called pro-sex feminists against anti-porn feminists. And of course, everybody thought they were being pro-sex. The anti-porn feminists thought that by trying to rid the world of degrading images, what they felt were degrading images of women, they were making room for a more liberated and satisfying, sexual culture. And of course, the pro-sex feminists thought that if feminism was about freedom, then women should have the freedom to make pornography or appear in pornography. And I think that, nobody could ever resolve that. And I think that we're still working on that. But what's been interesting to me when I interviewed women who called themselves pro-sex feminists, like, for example, the feminist pornographer Candida Royale, a lot of them said to me, it's one thing to be trying to make room for sort of different images of female sexuality and giving women room for all this kind of experimentation. But what you see with raunch culture, the sort of uniformity of it, the sort of the way that there's only one very rigid model of female sexuality that's allowed to come out, this sort of lusty, busty exhibitionist with big fake breasts and big blonde hair and long fingernails who's spinning around a pole. That's not what they had in mind.
Well, like you said before, nobody wants to grow up to be their mother. Everybody wants to kind of separate and create her own identity. And I'm wondering if there are things that turned you off about your mother's vision of what feminism was that you rebelled against.
Well, I don't know if it's generational rebellion or just a sort of coincidence of personalities, but it's like vanity skipped a generation in my family. No, it's true. My mother's mother, my grandmother, was a beautician, and she loved jewelry and makeup and clothes and all the rest of it. And my mother just is totally uninterested in all that stuff. I think she thinks it's boring and shallow. And I love that stuff. I mean, it just, I'm very interested in fashion, and I have a very sort of traditionally feminine self-presentation. And I don't know what that's about. I don't know if that's a rebellion or just a sort of glitch of personality. But it's certainly a difference between my mother and I.
Did you ever go through a period of wanting to deny yourself that, thinking that, it was superficial?
Well, absolutely. I mean, when I was in college, Wesleyan was this quite radical place, and you're sort of challenging everything, questioning everything. And like a lot of other college girls, I sort of went through this period where I thought, what am I shaving my legs for? This is a ridiculous use of time. And the thing is, it is a ridiculous use of time, And I think that, the femininity, Susan Brown Miller wrote a feminist classic, a fantastic book called Femininity, exploring the pleasures and absurdities of all these rituals. And it's hard to know, where to begin and where to end with this stuff. To me, in my book and in my life, the distinction I draw is sort of between the things that give you pleasure and the things that absolutely don't. For example, cosmetic surgery is something. I wrote an article for Vogue magazine a few years ago about women who had died having voluntary cosmetic surgery, facelifts essentially. There were several women who died a few years ago having facelifts. To me, it's just stunning. The number of breast implants that happen in this country has gone up 700% in the last 10 years. And I think it's very saddening that people are willing to go through that much pain and to risk their lives for an aesthetic. I think, it's like, it's one thing to wear a pair of shoes that hurt a little. It's another to put yourself in actual physical danger, to me.